we've measured the rate directly of biochar carbon decomposition and compared that to the rate of breakdown of biomass. The second line of evidence is that we find a lot more charcoal in soil than we'd expect to find based on the rate at which it's added. So we're adding a lot of fresh plant residues. We're only adding, in natural systems, charcoal through fires. Fires are actually quite inefficient at producing charcoal. It varies with the type of fire and the type of vegetation and a lot of things, but generally when a fire goes through, only about 2 to 5% of that carbon will be converted into charcoal. Most of it, because it's burning in oxygen or burning in air, will be converted all the way through to carbon dioxide. The third line of evidence is carbon dating charcoal that we can obtain from the soil, either a charcoal fraction or pieces of charcoal. When we do that, we generally find it's older than the average soil carbon age. So, going a little bit more into these first couple of lines of evidence. So, measurements of the rate of decomposition of charcoal. Here's some work that Jeff Baldock and I published quite a few years ago now, where actually Jeff did this work, I did some other parts on the paper, but it gets cited a lot, so I'll claim it. And it actually gets cited because of this part of it, not because of the part I did. Anyway, comparing the rate of breakdown over 120 days of different types of carbon. Glucose breaks down very quickly. Cellulose, which is pretty much what most of fresh plant material is going to be. We get about 70% loss of that carbon to carbon dioxide, so 70% mineralisation over the 120-day incubation. When we heat that cellulose, or that wood in this case, we see a decrease in the amount that's respired over that 120 days when we get to materials that I'd call charcoal, which is really only right at the end there. There is very little decomposition at all. So these are the rates of decomposition of fresh biomass and charcoal are really chalk and cheese. They're different by orders of magnitude. Now, of course, it's going to depend on the conditions of incubation. A lab incubation is not going to be the same as what happens in the field, and there's all kinds of complications. But I think the main thing to recognise is that charcoal is inherently stable towards decomposition. Okay, the second line of evidence is the amount of charcoal that we find in soil, and fortunately the first two speakers actually spoke about this quite a bit. This work is based a lot on what was done here before my time, and when I first came here in the CSIRO group, particularly the work of Jan Skemstad on this, where he developed a method for quantifying charcoal in soils and showed that in a lot of situations, a lot of soils, there is quite a bit of charcoal that's there. This is a figure I pulled from one of those papers. It's actually quite a difficult thing to do, to measure this, but and there's been a lot more measurements than these, but just in general terms, it demonstrates the point that we can have charcoal representing up to 30% of carbon in a small number of soils. This is sort of the original work. To get it accepted around the place, he had to show that the same happened in Europe and the US, which he did subsequently in a couple of other papers. And this is sort of the basis from which the work on fractionation that John talked about comes from, and they'd have much better numbers on what the proportion is. The important thing to note, though, is that there's a lot more charcoal in soils. It represents quite a big proportion, a relatively big proportion of the total amount of carbon in soils compared to the amount of carbon additions to soils, which is very small in any given year. Okay, the third part of the biochar concept, if you like, is the effect of biochar on soil productivity. Now we know that organic matter improves soil physical and chemical properties, and that's actually the reason for going to things like no-till. One of the reasons for going to no-till and developing methods, farming methods to increase the amount of carbon that's in soil is that the organic matter is good for soil fertility and soil productivity. It's good for things like improving water holding capacity, rates of water infiltration, structural stability, and retention of nutrients and providing a slow release form of nutrients. Organic matter does all these roles. What about biochar? Is biochar going to behave in the same way as other forms of organic matter? And the positive bit of it, or why we think that might be the case, at least in the long term, comes from the beneficial effects of char in what are called Terra Preta soils of the Amazon. So these are patches of dark soils that are found in the Amazon rainforest that are much more fertile than the surrounding soils. These soils are unusual for a number of reasons. They're very rich in organic matter, whereas, and this shows, compares the soil pits in a Terra Preta soil and an adjacent soil that is an oxisol, so a non-Terra Preta soil. So we have this dark colour associated with much higher amounts of organic matter. A lot of that organic matter is charcoal. Perhaps most of that organic matter is charcoal. The charcoal that's in those soils, we can measure we can carbon date and establish that it's very old. The other thing about these soils is that they are always associated with human occupation or evidence of human occupation. They appear to be sites where the native people have in the past cut down and burnt the rainforest residues, whether they were doing that on purpose or whether it's just pretty hard to burn forest in a wet climate, and so you end up with a lot of charcoal. Whatever the case, we end up with these soils that are very high in charcoal. And as you can see, the fertility of these soils is much greater than the fertility of the surrounding soil. So the simple conclusion you might come to from that is putting charcoal in soil is a good thing to do, and it's going to turn a weedy looking crop of corn that's a bit yellow and up to your knees into something that you're going to get lost in. This is, of course, the best case scenario. So why is this not going to be the case whenever we add charcoal to soil? And there's really two reasons for that. The first is that the aged charcoal, the charcoal that we find in these Terra Preta soils, is not the same as fresh charcoal that we produce. And the second is that not all soils and climates are like the Amazon. So, why should age matter for charcoal? One of the big benefits of aged charcoal in these soils seems to be the cation exchange capacity that they have. Cation exchange capacity is the negative charge on soil particles, and it allows soils to hold on to nutrients in a way that they don't leach, they don't get moved by water movement down through the profile, but they're not held so strongly that plants can't get at them. So the source of cation exchange capacity in the Terra Preta soils comes from very large negative charge that exists on aged charcoal particles. The point about fresh biochar is that it doesn't have this negative charge, and therefore it doesn't have a high cation exchange capacity. It has virtually no cation exchange capacity. So there's an important process that happens to charcoal over time. As charcoal gets oxidised, that oxidation of the char particles themselves creates a negative charge, and it's this negative charge that is responsible for the cation exchange capacity, the ability of these soils to hold on to nutrients against leaching. And going back to these NMR spectra, I'm usually, when I give talks, I'm the one presenting the NMR spectra. You've already seen a few. I've tried to limit myself, but what I'd like to point out here, this is some NMR spectra of soil clay fractions and silt fractions with different lengths of photo-oxidation. This is a process that Jan developed as a method for isolating charcoal from soils, and what happens is as you oxidise the organic matter, the soil clay fraction, in the presence of oxygen and UV light, what happens is that the charcoal is resistant to that treatment. So as John said, this peak at 130 is the main one due to charcoal, and with photo-oxidation what we're getting is loss of all the other types of organic matter, and the residual is mostly charcoal. The important thing to note from here is this little peak here. This little peak is due to carboxyl groups on the charcoal, on the aged charcoal. We don't see that at all in fresh charcoal. And trying to quantify how much carboxyl, there can be up to maybe 1 in 10, 1 in 20 of the carbons in aged charcoal will actually have a negative charge, will be or potential negative charge. It'll be an acidic carboxyl group, and that is where the CEC comes from in aged charcoal. Okay, the second part about CEC, if CEC is why aged charcoal is useful, is the soil and the climate. So what's so special about the Amazon in this story? Well, we're talking areas that are high in rainfall, so leaching is a big problem. So if nutrients are in a soluble form, they will be, they have a great propensity to be lost, whereas in lower rainfall areas that's not such a big problem. Another point about the Amazon soils is they contain different types of clays to the types of clays that we have. Generally, they have clays that don't have much cation exchange capacity. In most soils, it's the clay minerals that contribute the cation exchange capacity or are responsible for the cation exchange capacity of soils. In the Amazon, a couple of things. One is that they tend to be acidic. In acidic situations, you have a lower cation exchange capacity. They also have clay minerals, and I'm just trying to catch the eye of Jock to say, check I'm not getting this wrong. They tend to have oxide, iron oxides, aluminium oxides, or kaolinite, which are the clays that have a lower CEC. So these two things together, the CEC of aged charcoal and the environment and soils of the Amazon, means that if there's anywhere that aged biochar would be a good thing, it's going to be in the Amazon. So I guess what I'm saying is that expecting differences with addition of biochar like that in terms of productivity is probably being very, very hopeful. However, there's certainly some recent research that has discovered or identified fertile char-rich soils elsewhere, particularly in Europe and Australia. So it's not something that's specific to the Amazon, but certainly that's the first place it was recognised, and it's certainly where you'd expect that phenomenon to happen. I said one of the examples is an Australian example of aged biochar providing a very different soil to the surrounding soils. This is some work I did with a number of other people, and it's been recently published on what we call Terra, Preta, Australis. So these Terra Preta soils in Australia. And these soils have been developed on areas where charcoal deposition over many centuries has happened. These are Aboriginal oven mounds sites along the Murray River. And the thing to note is, again, we're seeing this difference in the colour of the soil. So we're getting very dark soils where we have a lot of charcoal, and the amount of carbon that is stored in those soils, whereas the adjacent soils, we see the normal profile of soil carbon. So starting, in this case, around 3–4% and quickly dropping at 10 centimetres to 1% or less. These Terra Preta Australis soils have much higher carbon contents all the way through, and we've shown that a lot of that is due to the presence of char. And once again, even though these soils aren't as low as in CEC as the rainforest soils in the Amazon, the presence of that aged biochar is making a big difference in the cation exchange capacity. Now, in terms of how long does it take for this process to happen, well, in the end, what we're going to have to do is add biochar to soil, or add chars to soil, and see what happens. So the ultimate way to see if biochar is going to provide a fertility benefit is to add it to soil and grow something on it. And the last talk this afternoon, last talk before the tea break, I think it is, I'm just having a look at the program. No, after the tea break, Greg Butler is going to talk about a number of field trials on soil carbon, but some of those are going to include biochar later on, so I won't go on about those. There has been a lot of field trials initiated, but interpreting the results of those is not entirely straightforward. Some reasons for this, if you look in the literature, of course you're going to be more likely to see examples where it's been successful because it's easier to publish stuff when things are successful. If it does nothing, then it's awfully hard to get excited about it and to be bothered sitting down and writing it, and it's hard to get it published. The initial addition of biochar isn't just the addition of carbon in the form of the aromatic structures. There's other stuff that is going to be there, in particular ash, and ash contains lime. It'll often contain nutrients, particularly phosphorus. So where you do see an effect of biochar, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the carbon that's doing something. It's not necessarily that Terra Preta phenomenon. It might be more about the addition of the ash. Another difficulty in field trials involving biochar is that where do you start? You can't cover all possibilities. We have biochars produced from different feedstocks at different temperatures, different heating rates, and then there's soil properties, so different soil types, different climates, different crop types, different managements, and so on and so on and so on. So as we get further into the field trials and start to see some of this complexity, what we're finding is that it works in some places, doesn't work in other places, works with some chars, doesn't work with other chars, and so on. So rather than going about it randomly, I think it's probably, at this stage anyway, probably better to think about why it might work, and it's only going to have an effect, a beneficial effect, if on productivity, if it limits some limiting factor to crop growth. So if there's problems with water holding capacity and it provides water holding capacity, then that is possibly going to improve things. If soil strength is limiting, the addition of biochar may decrease soil strength, and in that case you might see an effect. Also, things like water movement, pH, the effect of the ash component may be responsible for an effective addition of biochar if there are nutrient limitations, or if it has an effect on the biotic factors of soils if it has some effect on disease or beneficial organisms. So I think that the point here is with biochar field trials is to try and understand the mechanisms where there is an effect or where there isn't an effect, not just whether it works or it doesn't work. Okay, I was in a previous talk I was asked whether biochar was a myth or a miracle, and this is my feeling. It's neither. It's not a myth in that pyrolysis does provide an effective way to convert biomass into energy, and that potentially is a way to go to deal with energy issues. Biochar is certainly stable in soil, so converting biomass to biochar will certainly result in an increase in carbon stored in the soil. And there's no doubt that aged charcoal in soil does provide a fertility benefit in some soils, and we can see that directly. However, it's not a miracle. People have been using biomass as an energy source since before they used fossil fuels, and the reason why we went from that is because it has disadvantages. And the production of biochar simply to provide a stabilised form of carbon is not economic at this point and probably never will be. And in terms of the effect of biochar on productivity, you shouldn't expect to just chuck some charcoal on your land and double your harvest. It ain't going to happen. If it did happen like that, I think someone would have worked that out. It's not as if we haven't been farming and haven't had charcoal and haven't put the two together at some stage. So, in my opinion, the whole idea of biochar has a small but not minuscule chance of being really useful in this area in terms of carbon sequestration and effects mitigating climate change, and probably a moderate chance of being fairly useful. The upside of biochar, we know that organic matter is useful to soil fertility, and we've changed the way we farm in recent years in response to that. We are likely to be able to tailor biochar properties so it provides an immediate benefit to produce a pre-aged biochar, if you like. And one of the reasons why we haven't seen the benefits immediately is that it takes this process of aging to get that cation exchange capacity. So there's certainly possibilities in this area. And in terms of carbon sequestration, all we're really doing is utilising photosynthesis, which is a very efficient and convenient way of getting carbon out of the atmosphere, and as I said, shunting some of that carbon that we fix through biosynthesis in a way that is going to keep it in the soil. So, downside, to make a real difference, we need to source a hell of a lot of biomass, and once we get away from sources of waste biomass, there's issues of competition with food production and water, and also the use and the fate of nutrients. One thing that happens during pyrolysis is you probably lose most of your nitrogen, and the rest of the nitrogen may be fixed into a form that is not plant available. So that is certainly an instance where you're losing something from against the alternative of adding that biomass or leaving that biomass on the soil. We probably need all three aspects of biochar to work: the energy production, the carbon sequestration, and the fertility benefit to make the whole thing economic. And of course, things always end up a lot more complicated once you start doing them. Getting the balance of all three of these prongs and optimising them against one another and finding the situations where it's most likely to work is going to be quite a long process. Okay, I think I've got a few minutes still. Couple? Okay. Little bit of where the research is at. So this is, like I say, I'm a researcher, and so this is from my perspective. There's currently two quite large collaborative biochar research projects funded by GRDC and DAF, and Evelyn Kroll in Ciro is running those from here on the Wake campus. There's a number of different aspects of those projects. One is the characterization of biochars. There's trying to measure the stability of biochar, effects on crop yield and quality, life cycle analysis, effect on soil microbes, and interactions with pesticides, herbicides and contaminants. I'm only going to talk about the first couple of those. First one being biochar characterization. What we found by looking at these large number of biochars that have been produced in labs or produced commercially is that there's huge variability depending on the starting material, the treatment temperature, so what temperature you're pyrolysing at, and the pyrolysis conditions. So in terms of starting material, it's going to affect the concentration of nutrients, the liming value, and also it has an effect on how charry the char is. One thing, once you get into charcoal chemistry, is that it's not one material, and there's a range of materials. Mostly, for any one material, how stable it is seems to depend on the heat treatment temperature, but if you start with a different material, you can end up with, at the same temperature, something that's more degradable or less degradable. And I won't go into those bottom two plots. In terms of biochar stability, this is a really hard thing to determine. How long is it going to last for? This is what we really want to know, but it's hard to measure or estimate something that happens very slowly. Now, the best data we probably have at the moment is from controlled lab incubations, measuring CO2 release from charcoal, not over a 120-day period, but over much longer periods. At the moment, the best data we've got is for 4 years of incubations. What we find is that we get an initial loss of carbon that's reasonably quick, slower than for biomass, but still sort of over that weeks and months period, and then it tails off. After 4 years, we get mineralisation of carbon between about 0.5% and 8%, depending on the production temperature and the starting material. And this converts to half-lives of anything between 70 and 1,000 years, but the meaning of a half-life, when you've only looked at the first bit of the incubation, you don't really know whether there's different components, is a little bit problematic. Another complication is priming effects. A priming effect is when you add something, one form of carbon, does it increase the rate at which the other organic matter decomposes or decrease it. And we actually find both positive and negative priming effects at different times for different charts. So quite a complicated thing happening there. And of course, even when we do these measurements over a long period of time, that just tells you how stable it is under those conditions. And it could be affected by other things that happen. Okay, this is my last slide, I think. So the effects on crop yield and quantity, these, and Greg's going to give a lot more data, I think, some other examples later this afternoon. They're very dependent on the soil type and biochar type, and I think a lot of the immediate effects are probably due to liming and or nutrient effects, and there's a lot more that needs to be done. In terms of ASPAC issues about analysing, how will existing analytical methods see biochar? Well, it should be fully detected by dry combustion, although chars produced at high temperatures are quite thermally stable and they may be underestimated, so it's something that you probably should check. But in general terms, biochar will be detected by dry combustion pretty much as organic carbon. Walkley black probably will underestimate biochar, so you're probably not going to detect it at all. Whereas modified wet oxidation, things like the Heen's method, probably will detect most of the biochar. But again, it's going to depend on what that biochar actually is. Another question is whether analytical methods will be able to differentiate biochar from other forms of organic carbon. This is something that, as John said, is causing quite a few problems for when we're talking about charcoal that's already in soils. It's not an easy thing to do, and there's certainly no existing absolutely reliable technique as yet. So, concluding, biochar concept is the conversion of biomass to bioenergy by pyrolysis. When we add it to soil, that biochar is going to be a lot more resistant to mineralisation than biomass, and that provides a potential for carbon sequestration. Is likely to also influence soil properties, and hopefully that's in a beneficial way and improve productivity. It's certainly an area of active research. There's a lot of unknowns remaining, and if you do want some more information, that's the Australian-New Zealand Biochar Research Network or something like that, and there's plenty of information on that. Thanks.
Well, we had a lot of... any questions?
It's temperament.
Ron, there's obviously been a lot of excitement around biochar in the past decade, and that's only gone up in parts of the carbon farming initiative, but also the clean energy plan. It's interesting to see where the science is coming together nicely, but also the economics are a consideration as to what biochar application is going to take off. If you were to have a punt, what type of application do you think we'll see really take off the next 5 to 10 years? And I suppose I've got in mind here options of mobile pyrolysis units going throughout the valley, or pyrolysis on large-scale wood harvesting. What do you think might take a run?
I think probably the first cab off the rank will be waste organics, where there's biomass that has a negative value. People are trying to get rid of it, and certainly that helps if someone's willing to give you stuff for free or to pay for it. I guess, because it's got those three components, it's wherever one of those is particularly useful, it's more likely to be useful. I was listening to Radio National on my way to McDonald's for lunch yesterday, and they were talking about a situation in Cobar where they were looking at using the woody weeds that invade that area as a source of biomass, and also there at the edge of the power grid there's mining activities there where they need energy, so that energy part of it and a large and cheap or free or something that someone would pay to get rid of source of biomass is there. So I think it's probably in those areas where things are going to happen fairly quickly. I think the one that gets talked about a lot is crop residues, and I don't think that's really likely to be a place where it's going to happen quickly, because we've spent all this time actually breeding our crops not to have residues, not to have much in the way of chaff, and the residues that we have are important in nutrient cycling. They're important in holding soil together through the summer against water erosion, wind erosion. So I think we're unlikely to start gathering up that material and turning it into biochar. So I think it's areas where there's a source of cheap biomass that doesn't have another purpose, and where power is something that has a higher value than in the grid as a whole.
Ron, you mentioned that the cation exchange capacity of biochar increases with its age. Do you have any feeling of, so if you applied a reasonable amount of biochar, fresh biochar to like a red-brown earth in the mid-north? Do you have any feeling for how long it would take before you had a significant impact on cation exchange capacity in that sort of soil and climate?
Yeah, well, I think I could narrow it down between 10 years and 1,000, if that's useful. There's certainly a lot of work in that area. It doesn't happen instantaneously, and that's probably why people aren't seeing a benefit, and that's why we haven't stumbled upon it before. It's going to depend on the climate and the soil as well. Johannes Lehmann has done some work in Kenya where does seem to be oxidised groups on the charcoal building up on that decade scale, but probably we're talking a higher temperature and higher rainfall. It's something that the ageing of biochar certainly happens more quickly at higher temperatures, but whether or not that requires the char to be wet, whether it's biotic or abiotic, probably a bit of both, and understanding some of those will take a bit of time. I don't think it's going to happen to any great extent more quickly than over a period of 10 years, and then the economic value of that becomes quite questionable. Like, who's going to do something that's going to have a benefit for down the track in straight economic terms?
Okay, question out there. Really? I've already got one microphone, so I'm slowing up a bit. Go ahead.
Really, the same question. I just wondered whether anybody had followed the oxidation using solid state C13 NMR to see if anything, once you've lost that 0.5 to 8%, which obviously could lead to misunderstandings. I mean, over the next few years, and people have been going now for 10 years, has anybody tried to follow that oxidation?
Yeah, I have.
And
after the samples I had after 2 years, we don't see anything. Another situation was one of my PhD students who's here, Anna, has done some experiments on chars from bushfire sites. So we went up into the national parks in the Adelaide Hills, and where we knew when the most recent bushfire was, collected charcoal from those areas and looked specifically for a build-up of oxidised carbon there. We didn't see anything out to about 30 or 40 years, but it's quite difficult because the char that you can find in those sites tends to be large chunks that is coming from woody material from the larger trees. It's probably the finer material that's been incorporated in the soil that's going to build up those oxidised functional groups a lot more quickly. So, yeah, I did do some analyses on Johannes Lehmann's Kenyan charcoal soils. They were sites that had been burnt, purposely burnt, and they had some idea of when that had happened, and they ranged from, within the last year to 1 year, I think sort of something like 4 or 5 years, 10 years, out to 9 years. And certainly for the older chars in that series, we seem to be seeing carboxyl groups on the charcoal. Technically, it's quite a difficult thing to do, and there's other things that happen. For example, the biochar will sorb other organic matter to it, some of which has carboxyl groups on it. So just because you're finding carboxyl groups in your char sample doesn't necessarily mean it's coming from the charcoal itself. But whenever we look at the charcoal fraction, the resistant organic carbon fraction in soils, it always has those oxidised groups. So it happens all over the place, sometime between a decade and a couple hundred years. But yeah, we continue to work on it and to find situations where we have charcoal of a known age that's been in the environment, and we can quantify those processes.
We've got time for one more person down the front.
Thanks, Ron, for a really interesting presentation. Interesting talking. It needs at least high temperature for pyrolysis. And how will it produce this temperature, this mass temperature? It is associated with any carbon dioxide production, or no? If you produce this mass temperature by burning coal, so it produces some carbon dioxide, and it goes to a temperature, and also carbon dioxide is really a contributor of greenhouse gases. So what is the comments about?
Could you just repeat that?
How do you get it started?
How do you start the pyrolysis?
Yeah, it needs high temperature.
Yep.
How it this mass temperature?
Yeah. The pyrolysis side of things is not something I know a lot about. I think once it's going, it's self-sustaining because you get a lot of energy, and it's certainly an area of the engineering of pyrolysis units for this purpose is something that's continuing and improving. I think the idea is to get these things running at a constant rate so that the waste heat that you produce from actually burning the volatile materials, so you get energy from that, but there's waste heat that goes back into preheating up the material. But to get the initial starting, you'd have to use natural gas or something. There'd be an alternative source of energy that would get it up to a certain heat, at which time the volatile component starts to come off, and once you get enough of that volatile material, then you can circulate that back in towards the heating process.
But initially, you have to start with like charcoal or gas like this.
Yes. Yeah.
Produce some carbon dioxide.
Yes. And you have to take that into account. Yeah.
Just my question is actually, what is your comments about this? How will you minimize this carbon dioxide production?
I think by continuing, I think it's turning it off and turning it on is going to be inefficient. So it's about having a continual source of biomass that you're continually processing. But yeah, the processing side of things and is a different area. And I do know there's continual improvements in pyrolysis units for this purpose, and they can be tailored. There's trade-offs between the amount of carbon that gets fixed and the amount of carbon that goes to energy production. There's also, with temperature, there's also trade-offs in the nature of that charcoal. So you might want a lower temperature charcoal that ages more quickly and produces that productivity benefit. That seems to be the way things are going, or a higher temperature charcoal which is more stable and you get lower losses over time. So those kind of things can still be tailored. The hard thing is knowing how good your product is going to take a long time.